Morning, everyone. Welcome to our March Local Superintendent Advisory Council meeting. Just want to remind everyone the purpose. We're mandated by KRS 156.007. The charge of the council is to advise the Chief State School Officer and the Kentucky Board of Education concerning the development of administrative regulations and education policy. Chief State School Officers shall submit all proposed administrative regulations, and educational policies for review by the council prior to seeking approval by the Kentucky Board of Education. And before we get started, I think with the occurrences that's happened in Nashville and loss of life, what seems to continue a lot in schools, I would appreciate if everyone would join me in a moment of silence for the families that lost loved ones yesterday. Thank you very much. May God wrap that community in his arms. All right, to begin with, we would like to welcome Commissioner Glass to provide an update on the Kentucky Department of Education. Commissioner Glass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll do my best to be brief. I know we've got a lot to cover today. A couple of updates on efforts that we have underway. One of the things that we were pleased with seeing come out of this legislative session was the funding and restructuring of funds for the creation of a reading research center. So we're excited about that, and we'll be putting together a request for proposal process around that. We hope to have strong bids from around the country, and it really goes hand in hand with our efforts around the expansion of letters training, science reading training that we've been working on for the past few years. There really have been a lot of very positive developments in literacy supports for teachers, literacy instruction in the state. So this will continue to support that. And, we're excited about that. In addition, hopefully if you and your districts are engaged in some of the efforts around problem and project-based learning that are available in the state, a lot of that's funded using COVID relief funds. We really wanted to have school as we came back from the pandemic be better than it was before, and consider how we can make student experiences meaningful, rich, engaging, and deep. And I know that there are countless examples that are already in place in Kentucky. One of the things that Kentucky has really invested a lot of energy in is creating really meaningful experiences for students. But we really felt, and based on the listening tours that we did when I became commissioner, that was a priority that we work on student experiences as the sort of touchstone and most important area of focus. I'll briefly just touch on the legislative session. I've made my positions on several of the things that have been passed out of this legislative session clear. I don't need to belabor it. If you want to know what those are, you can just Google my name and you can find a lot about it. But I will say that in the time that we have remaining with this legislative session, there are some things that have not been done that I'm most concerned about. They include efforts to stem the teacher shortage that we have and do something significant to bring more individuals into the teaching profession and sustain and support those that are already in the teaching profession. Representative Tipton does have a bill. Even he would, I think, characterize it as sort of light touch. It probably is not at the scale of what we need. It is a first step, but it was even scaled down from where he started. And I don't think there are sufficient steps nor resources there to really have much of an impact. But it is a first step. But we got a real challenge. Nationally, the number of people entering the teaching profession has fallen off by about a third. And coupled with that, we have seen that effect in the long term here in Kentucky. It has stabilized some over the past couple of years. But make no mistake, if you feel like you have fewer teachers applying than you ever did before, that's because that's what's happening. Coupled with that, we are seeing a marked increase in the number of people leaving the teaching profession, about 5% increase over the previous year into this year. And so that accounts for a couple of thousand more teaching vacancies. So we have about a third fewer teachers, and we've stabilized on that side, and then we add a couple thousand more vacancies in the state. That's why you're feeling the pinch when it comes to looking for qualified people for positions. So really are concerned about The teaching profession, support for the teaching profession, I think it's going to have to be a long-term engagement with the legislature, because they really the ones that have the resources and authority to do something significant at the scale that we need. Another element left undone is some kind of funding stabilization related to absences that you're experiencing because of ongoing COVID outbreaks in your community, RSV, the flu. I think there was a real hope that things would just snap back to normal. That hasn't been what many districts have experienced. We typically see districts 95, 97% on average daily attendance. Kentucky is a state that funds schools based on in-person attendance, as you're well aware. That's not the only way to count students, but that's how Kentucky has done it for many years. When you have large-scale epidemics or a tridemic, in this case, that results in absences, it's going to mean a funding loss. So out of something that you really have no control over, and you do have these students in your schools and your communities that you're having to serve, you may end up with less money. So I'm concerned about that. That hasn't been something the legislature has picked up in earnest and done anything about. We did provide some models and ideas on how they can stabilize that, but so far that hasn't happened. And then finally, we have heard, and I appreciate the advocacy from several growing districts around the state that have been stuck on the 2019 funding level, even though they've experienced significant growth in their districts. And so they may have hundreds more students that they're not having funding for, that they're having to provide services to in their community. So that's stretching them very thin too. So all three of these areas are, I would say, concerns or things that were not done or have not been done yet in this legislative session. I mean, still do have a couple of days. They could pull something together and run it through and send it to the governor. I think anything positive around these three areas, if the governor would receive that, he would likely sign it. But I think that's what I'm most concerned about in the immediate sense with our schools in the state, is what was not done this legislative session. So, Mr. Chair, I'll turn things over to you and see if there's any questions on the areas that I've raised or anything else or whatever you want to talk about, or we can move on to the next items.
Are there any questions for Commissioner Glass? I do have a couple comments. First of all, I'd like to thank Representative Tipton for his efforts. It is a good start. It is a start on addressing the teacher shortage. But I think if you ask anyone around the table or any of our colleagues throughout the state, the number of applicants that we're having for teaching positions is dwindling greatly. Just as one example, a couple of years ago, had a PE opening. We went 4 months without a certified applicant. Even as a librarian, we had to do an emergency certification to get a librarian and a media specialist at one of my schools. If we have 2 certified applicants for a elementary teaching position, it's a blessing. So again, we're very thankful for all the alternative options that we have, but still yet, as far as teaching shortage, it's a real problem. It's a real problem in our area. Also too, as far as funding stabilization, just to use Lawrence County as an example, we will lose over $500,000, probably closer to $700,000, depending on our attendance. And the reason for that is a lot of times people don't understand, as most districts have lost students. A lot of in Eastern Kentucky, a lot of our rural areas in Western Kentucky and others. Of course, there's some growth areas. I think there's 21 districts I think were considered growth, as far as, if numbers correct me, don't quote me on that. I think there were several districts that increased. But for example, for us, if you combine the ADA and ADM combined, we're looking at a 7% decrease, a little over 7%. Look at Mr. Cochran, I think you're well over 10%. Some of the others around our table, we have several that are going to lose some funding. So what does that mean for us? We're looking at a phase out of how do we make cuts. We sat down yesterday and we took all day to look at, I'm going to have to make about $385,000 in cuts in teaching. So again, teaching or other areas. And then the next year, that'll leave us with over 100,000 we'll have to cut. So those are people that will be losing jobs and will be losing positions. Now, I will say a couple of those positions weren't filled due to the teaching shortage. So again, there's some push there, we understand, but still yet the funding stabilization is a real issue for most of the districts across our state. There are some provisions that allow some clawback if you're over 10% or if you're in a flood or a tornado area, which is great for, but still yet many of us that fall in that 3 to 10% are kind of in limbo. We don't have any options of how to get that money back. that combined with facility needs is a real issue for our district. But again, we do thank Representative Tipton and the legislature for the start on addressing the teacher shortage. We do hope in the coming days that we hear something about budget stabilization because it is a real issue for our districts. So again, thank you, Dr. Glass, for bringing that to everyone's attention again. Well worth repeating. So again, if any of our legislators are listening, give me a call. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. That being said, we'll move on to, or I'm sorry, any other comments from anyone?
I do have a question,
Yes,
Mr. Chair. With regard, Dr. Glass, to the bills that have passed with emergency clauses, we have guidance on the application of some of those. Some of those are really, like right now or in the next few days.
Yeah, so in yesterday's Monday message, we touched on that some. There are 8 bills that have emergency clauses that are likely to be enacted, or even if the governor vetoed them, they're likely enacted. Some of them relate to things that we will do here at the department. And so in those cases, we're already looking at what changes we have to make so that we're in compliance. We're shooting for mid-April for when we'll have guidance out on any of those laws with emergency clauses once we get them finalized. So here in the next couple of weeks, guidance on what we think those things be. Important are it's always worth repeating in Kentucky that our guidance is non-regulatory. So it's not a mandate, it's not required, it's just our opinion on how things should go. But we do our best to analyze the law and what we think best practices and provide guidance to districts to help you decide how you handle those new laws and regulations.
Thank you.
Anyone online? Move on to our next item on the agenda is policies for review and action. And we have one policy for our review and action. It deals with Kentucky minimum specifications for school buses. Jay Ritter, Lisa Hanley with the Office of Finance and Operations in the Kentucky Department of Education will make a presentation.
Morning, everybody. It's nice to see everybody here in virtually. Glad summer has returned to this room at least. Alyssa's online with us. She's going to go through these changes. This is an annual bus specifications changes. As we review these, there's quite a bit of input that goes into this. Alyssa, I'm going to turn it over to you if you can hear us okay.
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Lisa Hanley. I am the Pupil Transportation Branch Manager. We had the specification committee meet, and the top 7 changes that came about from this are we updated our warranty verbiage. Currently, the date the start date is in August, but as most of you know, our buses are not coming in a timely manner at this time. So we have requested to update the warranty to 10 days after the new bus inspection, whichever is later. So if it comes after August, it won't start until 10 days after the inspector has completed the new inspection and the district has accepted the bus. We've removed specific tests for the floor burn tests. We have matched the nationally recognized tests. The only difference was a couple of feet within the test numbers that were required. So to conform with the rest of the industry, we have updated to the national specifications for that. We have also added interior lamps that they shall be turned on when the emergency exits are opened and the key is in the ignition. The emergency alarm is also required to turn on when the emergency exits are open. So this will allow the driver to see what's happening and illuminate the bus in an emergency, or if students are opening windows and doors that they should not be. A big thing this year and in the past has been trespassing on our school buses. So we have added the verbiage use handrail and no trespassing on the stepwells. So as the bus doors open, the verbiage will be there, and that is the warning to the adults or anyone else trying to enter the school bus. We've also added the allowance of the OEM cup holder due to extreme heat conditions in the summer and in the fall. Just like with our students where we've allowed water, we need to be able to do the same for the bus drivers who are on there longer than some of those students. We've also removed the required location for the lift to allow additional seating configurations, which may allow for more students on the bus. Previously, the lift was required basically depending on the bus in the front of the bus. It can now be put into the back or towards the center of the bus, which will allow full seating forward and aft of the wheelchair positions versus from two per seat to three per seat. So, and a big item that has gone back and forth are what they call the lollipop lights on the front of the school bus for the Type C school bus. We have added the allowance to, or we have re-added those to the standard versus options, as that is what the school districts have recommended. A lot of the other items that are within the specifications are cleanup. So if you have any specific questions, I'll be happy to answer those.
Yeah, I'll open up the floor to any questions. Ms. Hamlin? Ms. Hamlin, a quick question as we've talked about funding. You look at these changes, is there any marginal or large amount of cost that's added to buses due to these changing requirements?
There are not. That is something that we always ask when we're making changes. Some of the items are very minimal. The lollipops, uh, the lettering. When looking at the configuration of the bus, if they're changing the location of the wheelchair door, that may add cost depending on where they put it, but that will be a district decision whether or not they make those changes.
Real quick question, and maybe Mr. Allen can answer this as well. As a result of placing that no trespassing sign on there, will that allow us to take legal action against someone who does enter the bus without permission? Certainly, pretty sure. Okay, all right, thank you.
Other questions? Anyone online? Okay, here none, we'll move forward with the vote. It does require a motion and a roll call vote. Do I have a motion to approve the proposed Kentucky minimum specifications for school buses?
Gary Burchett, Harrison County, I make a motion.
Burchett, second.
I'll make a second.
Second, Mr. Riley. And before we do a roll call vote, I want to remind everyone online, please unmute your microphones for a moment. Make sure that you do that. And Dr. Brewer, if you wouldn't mind.
Kirk Bitterstaff,
Kirk Bitterstaff, yes.
Mike Borchers,
Mike Borchers, yes.
Gary Burchett,
Gary Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes. Robbie Fletcher, yes.
Bill Hodges,
Will Hodges, yes.
Sheila Mitchell, yes. David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Bransdell.
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
All members present have voted.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer.
Question.
Yes, ma'am.
So is the no trespassing on the stairwell a required signage, or is it just stated in the changes? Is it a required?
It's Lisa.
Yeah.
Bear with me. Let me verify here. I believe we put it as a standard on it is standard.
And that it says shall have the words no trespassing and 2-inch decals.
Correct.
So it will be amended.
And you can retrofit your buses if you choose to do so. Otherwise, it will be new buses going forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Leslie.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Next, we have two review items. First, we welcome the team from the Office of Finance and Operations led by Associate Commissioner Kenny to provide an update on the facilities regulation revision process. We're talking about House Bill 678, facility regulation review update.
It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Just to kind of set the context for our presentation today, we are bringing before you sort of our recommendations and invite conversation and comments on the work that the Office of Finance and Operations Facilities Branch has been doing over the last almost a year, actually 2 years, as it relates to facility construction and planning in your local school districts. To kind of tee it up, if we can go to the first slide, please. I have with me Che Ritter, who is the director in the Division of District Support Services. We also have staff here from the Facilities Branch that can help with questions that you may have. We're going to start off with a little bit of background and context from House Bill 678. And the reason that we're doing that for you is because a lot of the recommendations that we're going to move forward with, we are supportive of some of the 678 provisions that are already in place. Even though 678 is set to expire, it's temporary in nature right now legislatively, but we are supportive of many of the things that 678 has done. So in the 2022 regular session, 678 was passed in response to really needs of the coronavirus pandemic, and we needed to expedite your projects at the local level. We were having some problems with supply chain, and we needed things to just move along a little more expeditiously. And as part of that, this eliminated certain KDE approvals where districts had to come to us and seek approval, and allowed you to go ahead and commit your projects, whether that was funding or financing or design or construction. It allowed you all to move forward more quickly. It is important to note that with 678, districts are still required to follow all the statutes and regulations that are in place. It just allowed you to move forward without some pre-approvals by KDE. Districts could use architects or engineers to estimate the cost of your projects and advance your financing, which is another thing that guided things. And as of right now, 153 districts have basically adopted this expedited process. So very much interested, districts very interested in moving things along, and we have 153 that are now opting out of the regular process and moving forward. Next slide, please. So some of the things that also in 678, it required KDE to use 30 business days to approve DFPs, so your district facility plans, and your request for either acquisition or disposal of property. We put a little bit of metrics in there in the slide for you to see. On average, 8.9 days for approval of DFPs since the passage of 678, and then 10.4 days for the property acquisition or disposal. So KDE is easily meeting the deadlines of the 30 days. I will say one of the things that's made it a lot easier for us to approve very quickly is, and I want to compliment districts, we are seeing more and more districts sending us everything we need, complete submissions that we would call, in order for us to review and quickly get that decision back to you. So compliments to the districts that are really focusing on a complete submission, which allows us to do what we need to do timely. KDE is continuing to provide technical assistance. So even if you are a 678 district, we want to encourage and remind you that we are still available to help you as you move projects along. One major difference is BG1 applications are filed for record keeping purposes. So you are not waiting on us to approve a BG1 if you're a 678 district. What that has done is really has shifted the responsibility and accountability for those projects to the local school district, giving you more local control and autonomy. There are a couple of other things big changes from 678, allowing districts to use restricted funds for extracurricular facilities. So that was something that really the Kentucky Board of Education, we heard from a lot of school districts, the importance of being able to use restricted funds, as that really supports the whole instruction of your student is being able to use restricted funds for that. And then finally, federal funds, you still need to seek federal funds approval, and specifically on, we have a lot of pre-approval requirements for your ESSER funds that you're using for COVID relief. Really important that we continue to see that request from school districts about the approval of ESSER funds for facility projects. Your BG1s prior to 678, your BG1s would come in and we would approve those. And so it was kind of locked in our system already. But since we now have districts that are not using that BG1 process and getting approval, we have to have that separate approval to use the ESSER funds. Next slide, please. So let's quickly go over sort of the scope of review that 678 has asked the department to fulfill. They asked us to conduct a review of all the administrative regs, the statutes, the planning manuals, the construction manual, and really look to see how we can improve processes and modify school facilities to increase efficiency. We were also asked to update those regulations and materials due to the changing trends in the economy and changes in the industry. So that was another look that we were making as we went through this process. And then they also asked us to look at the most commonly granted waivers and make changes to either eliminate them. Districts need to come to the Kentucky Board of Education and ask for waivers. So we've done that. The top three of those waivers, as we looked at, what were the top three that districts were having to come to the Kentucky Board of Education? The first was, and these really aren't in particular order, but districts were needing to come to us to seek a waiver for site acquisition and preparation costs that exceeded 10% of the project cost. So that was one that we were starting to see more waiver requests. Another one was new school projects that exceed 120% of the total gross area of the model program of spaces. So anytime that you were exceeding that percentage, we were seeing waivers. And then the third waiver is something that 678 already really directly addresses, and that is the access to the restricted funds for extracurricular facilities. So we have, it also, 678 also asked us to consult with the Department of Housing, Building and Construction, just to see if we had any overlap in our responsibilities or anything that could either go to them or could come to us, and we've done that. And we also have a reporting requirement to the Kentucky General Assembly, and we are required to report to them on the scope of our total comprehensive review by September 1st of this year. And where we are today and what we're bringing to you today is we actually had engaged a group, a facilities work group that we called it. We did that a couple of summers ago. We kicked that off before 678 happened. And we have re-engaged that group after we've spent a lot of time internally and also reaching out to interested stakeholders about what changes need to be made. So we reconvened that facilities work group in February, and we've heard comments and feedback from them. So we're now going to share with you sort of the presentation or a high-level presentation that we shared with that work group, and also invite your feedback and comments along the way. So I'm going to turn it over to Shay now. Oh, I'm sorry. I have one more slide. If we can go to the next slide. I was going to recap sort of the things about 678 that we think should stay in place, that we think are working well and have improved processes for both us here at KDE and for you. We believe that after the provisions of 678, which are scheduled to expire in 2024, we believe that certain provisions should stay in place, and that would include the ability for local boards to continue to operate under the provisions of 678, which allow you all to do your own funding, financing, design, construction, all that without prior approval of KDE. However, we have one little phrase on the end of this that is not currently in 678. We believe very strongly that district staff should have professional development training in order to best represent their districts, their constituency, and their boards, their local boards. So we still through the same process, still allowing that local control, but we would strongly advocate for training to be required. Your facilities people are professionals in your district and in your community. And just like your finance officers, your food service directors, your bus drivers, who all have required training, we think it's really important that your facility staff have required training as well. We would also encourage that we keep that requirement on KDE that we have to approve your DFPs and your acquisitions and disposals within 30 business days. That's working really well for us and for you. And so we would encourage that timeline stay and continue in a more permanent format. We would also recommend that capital funds usage be approved by your local boards rather than having to come to us. And so again, that would expedite things. Continue the use of the allowance of restricted funds on extracurricular facilities. We've heard very, very loudly from districts and our Kentucky Board of Education that that's important. And so we recommend that would stay in. And then there are also some local board approvals that we would shift again from KBE down to your local board. So again, trying to push as much as possible to the local boards and your school districts to again keep that expedited process. So now I'm going to turn it over to Shay, and we're going to get into a few examples of some of the recommended changes that we're going to have before you. In today's presentation, you see this is really a PowerPoint and sort of a high-level overview. Much of these changes will take regulatory action. And so we will be back in front of you as we develop the line by line regulatory recommended changes. Sort of the devil is in the details. But we wanted to give you some kind of high-level highlights of the work and the recommendations that we've been making. So, Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Chair Fletcher, I believe there's a question on the screen. Orchards, I think.
Borchers, Superintendent Borchers.
Yes, thank you, Che. You know, this is your pesky superintendent down in Ludlow. But Robin, I know you had alluded to the training. And in the work group, one of the big concerns was being a requirement to add another position if you didn't have a director of facilities being a small district. So would that just be that there'd be a requirement for someone within the district to receive that training, i.e. a superintendent, or in a larger district, the directors of facilities, but not add a position, so to speak?
Thank you. That's absolutely correct. Our recommendation is that you have a point person, whoever that is, whether it's the superintendent, a facilities director, someone that everyone knows is the person that if you have questions or concerns about facility, that's the person that you go to. So you can always have more training. We expect and would desire at least one person in your district to have that mandatory training.
Thank you, Superintendent Borchers. And follow up to that? Any questions from anyone else before we move on to Mr. Ritter?
A little bit about the changes. These are pretty high level changes. And for those of you all that can travel back in time a little bit, this is taking quite a long time. So there's a lot of work in behind these changes, hours and hours of conversation, some debates, a few arguments, but basically we wanted to, our goal here is to add more flexibility, but at the same time, update this manual. Last time it was updated was 2008. We were a lot younger. And, we look at this now, so much has changed since then. The way we build a school, of course, coming out or going through a pandemic, has really changed the way we look at our facilities. So a lot of applause for my staff that actually, took the time to reach out to all these different groups. We've reached out to internal and external to get a lot of input on, how should the school be designed going forward. And that added flexibility, I think, will, pay huge dividends down the road as well. So I'm going to jump through a few of these fairly quickly. This is a pretty big one. This is our existing LPC membership based on district size. And really the part to pay attention to here is that very top line, number of schools per district and what that means as far as the size of your LPC. If you go to the next slide, please, you'll notice that number of school centers has changed. And in short, it reduces, it kind of shifts this size of the LPC. And you'll notice too, they consolidated district facilities director and central office staff as it's sort of duplicative person in some cases. That may be the same person now. So this will change the format of the LPC. However, we think the process that's in place is a good process. There's a lot of good public input. It's a local planning committee, which we obviously like, and that helps kind of get this process started. And talking to many superintendents throughout, whatever DFP, part of the DFP process they're in, the LPC plays a huge role in this. We want to make sure we get the right kind of public input and people in the community to get involved as well. You can go to the next slide, please. So we're clarifying the roles and responsibilities, and I'm going to refer you back to the 2008 manual. It's online. You can go out and read it and fall asleep like I do sometimes reading it. But part of it was we wanted to move the language in the manual so that it's more clear as you read through it that this is the role of the local board of education, local planning committee, and so on and so forth, instead of it being all throughout the documents. Your architects will be able to jump out there easily and see this is my responsibility in this process. KDE can obviously see our responsibility in this process, as well as your local board of education members can go out and look to in your LPC. We consolidated some of the meeting requirements. We're not necessarily reducing the requirements, but, and I'm going to kind of turn and look behind me here because I want to say this correctly. We're going to have an LPC will have a minimum of 2 meetings, but we would always suggest more. So we want to give some flexibility. And obviously, sometimes during a DFP development, I'm sure some of you all have been through it where the changes are minimal. Just not much to it, nothing exciting. But if you, for example, are trying to do a consolidation or something that's going to be a little more volatile or potentially more volatile or something large you really want more community input on, you have complete flexibility to add more of those meetings. We're further defining priority 5. There's a few reasons for this. And priority 5, if you recall, this is at sort of the bottom of your district facility plan. These are those, extracurricular. It's defined as field houses in the state. It's basically athletic stuff. We're also going to kind of split these up and say, A, of course, is 125% of the model program. These are your excess spaces. So typically in the past, this would require a waiver. If you wanted to kind of build larger than was required. And then B gets into the athletic facilities, and C is basically anything that's not on your DFP that comes up that you want to build. Now, the reason we're splitting these up, it's better for reporting purposes. And if the General Assembly ever wants to fund specific priority 5 projects, for example, they want to throw, I don't know, say hundreds of millions of dollars towards, athletic centers or something like that, or a stadium or a field house. They can certainly do so and say it's going to be only to 5B, for example. So this makes it a little more clear if that ever comes up. And on the reporting end, we would use this obviously to sort of back into data requests we get. How many districts are addressing this? How many have spent on excess space? How many have spent on athletics? Things like that. So this helps us in the back end as far as the data requests we may or may not get. And next slide, please. So I think this first statement says a lot. We're going to revise the model, or at least propose to revise it to reflect current educational practices. I imagine in 2008, they had the same thought in their mind. I always think back to my middle school, which had no walls. It's probably what's wrong with me today. So we've learned from that. We've moved on gratefully. A lot of the changes we talk about today, we'll talk a little bit more about this: security, safety, ease of cleaning, things like that we need to think about going forward. DFP approvals. In the past, we would have to bring every district facility plan to the Kentucky Board of Education, which meets about every 2 months. Now, the approval is much faster. 678 allowed us to approve it internally. And if for some reason we did deny, there's an appeal process to the Board of Education. I will say, I think on an earlier slide, let's say 8.9 days or something like that. We turn these around if it's complete and we get everything. Our guys work very hard because we know people are waiting on them, so projects can get moving. So I'm going to give a kudos to them for working through these. And a lot of times we used to joke, whoever at Jefferson County, that's all they ever looked at. These are complex plans that we want to make sure are workable and feasible and obviously compliant. So this approval, we think, is a really good thing to keep internal to KDE. And of course, if there ever was a disagreement, we didn't think it was a good DFP, but always appeal that to the Board of Education. Again, the 30-day window, this was mentioned earlier, we're fine with that. Another conversation we had with the group was some districts, their DFP may not change very often. And to simplify that process, to just extend the 4-year window. Right now, it's a little too convoluted. They want to push it out to 8 years. There should be an easier path for that. This one, eliminate duplication of assessments, K-Fix, DFP. I believe this is cleanup that we had in the planning manual itself. We go to the next slide, please. One that will actually save us a little bit of money, virtual site inspections. So going back in time, 2008, we had the internet obviously, but now with Google Maps and everything else, it's a little easier and using a little bit of common sense. It may not be necessary for our guys to hit the road. And right now we're required to actually show up and physically inspect any property you're buying. So if you're buying half an acre next to your building or parking lot, that's part of a cornfield, and you're never going to build on it, it's probably not necessary for us to come down there. But in a lot of cases, as I've learned the hard way, property is complex. If you're buying some land, there's all sorts of things to be aware of, utilities, easements, everything imaginable we've seen and I've seen in the last 2 years. It's kind of scared me away from ever buying property. But we feel that the inspections, we can speed up some of these smaller purchases or what we would call minor acquisitions, if you will. Or if we deem it, it's just not necessary for us to physically inspect it. We're going to address some provisions for acquiring easements, eminent domain and donation. We're sort of, I think, cleaning that up a little bit too. I don't believe that's in the regulation. And we're going to streamline property acquisition through FATPAC. And if you recall, that's where your BG1 comes in. This helps us as far as keeping track internally. Where is it at? A lot of times in the past, we would get calls like, I don't know where this is. We're in a hurry. Or this way we can tell we're waiting on you all or you're waiting on us. And our guys can cycle through it every day and look, we know this property's, or we're waiting on a document, for example. This has really helped us keep track of and reporting down the road if we need to on where property's sitting and why it's taking so long. Unfortunately, even if the district's done everything, we've done everything, there are factors outside of us that can cause some delays, maybe an appraisal or something like that. And it keeps all of us communicating, which we found to be very important. Again, 30 days, as long as we have complete submissions, that's going to be, the umbrella in which we operate. This is a pretty big change to major acquisition and minor acquisition. And if you could jump to the next slide, I think we have a little bit more expansive definition or example. Major acquisition, if you're going to, for the construction of a new school, central office, this is what you think it is. Now, when we get into minor, this is sort of that, I wouldn't necessarily say it's contingent against your land, but these are going to be your smaller acquisitions. We've had districts that they have an opportunity to buy an old house they want to knock down and turn into parking. So this gives us a little more latitude in that regard. And again, we hope speeds up the acquisition process. Next slide, please. So this is a pretty big one. One thing I think that's sometimes misunderstood as far as I think one of the largest and most important items in that planning manual is what we call LSAC, locally identified program space allowance. Again, emphasize the word local. This is that flex area that as you're building a building, there's some, even in the existing manual, there's some room in there for you all to have this. This is really what we want in this school. As all of you all know, you drive around the state and you see Frederick Douglass and Fayette, or you go to a high school somewhere else, it's going to be very different inside, and their needs may have been different when they built it. So this LSAC provides more flexibility for you all to determine, what do we want to do with this space? Do we want collaboration areas? Do we want to make a little bit larger, science room or science lab? Do we want to have a little bit larger central office or administrative office? Do we want to have bigger rooms for counselors? And there's flexibility now, but we're actually doing something a little different. If you'll notice that second one, CTE programs, we're really going to defer to CTE on those spaces. But what we did is we took what space we had in our system for our purposes and moved it to LSAC. So we're actually adding quite a bit of room to it. Again, this is flexible room, and that's a really important part of that. The locally identified career and tech education allowance. So that was in our old manual. You can see it today, and that's what we're going to move to LSAC. But CTE, if you were going to say add a new class, and they say, well, you need 3,000 square feet for that type of class, that will not hit your allowance over on the facility side. That is strictly through CTE, and we basically have deferred to them on all of this. And we're trying to future-proof this because in 5, 10, 15 years, we have no idea what these classes will look like and what, the new pathways will look like. That's changed a lot since I'm sure you were in school and I was in school. It's a completely different world. And we want to leave that flexibility with CTE rather than us. We can't keep up with those changes in my shop. So we want to leave that to the experts to help us with that.
So that's a little bit confusing. That I was trying to make sure that we have explained that appropriately. So the career and tech ed square footage that typically would be approved in the Division of District Support Services, basically saying, let's take that out, move it to the career and tech ed side. They control and basically say, these are the square footage that you need there. We've left the square footage piece, though, in the model program of spaces. So you're going to get that square footage. You're not being penalized because it's being taken out. It's being left there and used as locally decided space. So again, a flexibility that if you want to use it, it would be there and available to you. That makes sense?
Part of the administration suite increases, one of the bigger parts of the review we did, of course, was work with the Kentucky Center for School Safety. In light of yesterday, obviously, this is incredibly important and was not really addressed in 2008. We wanted to make this a more defined area as well as a priority in the facility, and mostly for the SRO or SROs. Having a defined area rather than put them, wherever you could is going to become very important in the future, we think. Guidance counseling, kind of the same thing. One office per 250, which gets us in alignment with that statute. Larger schools, proportional increase in your square footage for administrative spaces, increase some conference room size, and probably hear some principals applaud here, increase size of the principal's office. We also worked with our special education area downstairs to talk to them about the needs now, as that has changed quite a bit since 2008. So that's actually been increased as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? We still kind of laugh at this because I had the computer classrooms. I grew up in that age, and now we've redefined it to digital labs. I don't know what it will be in 20 years. I won't be here, hopefully, but we've gotten out of the computer classrooms. This is probably not really a functional thing anymore. Auditorium space to accommodate storage. This did not exist in the old manual, so this is something we're adding. The Frisky area, Family Resource Center, increased that from 300 to 500. Doesn't seem like a lot, but 200 can really make a difference in a small office. Elementary school changes, and this is the one that I've had to have explained to me a few times, probably more than once for sure. They're going to add some area to your gym, so the bleachers themselves won't come out or won't take away from that as you pull those out and stuff like that. It seems like a simple thing, but apparently this is a pretty serious gripe. A pretty serious gripe that we wanted to address. And the science classroom in elementary schools, we've added that to the model program spaces. And next one. So this is a lot of information, and it probably will take you some time to digest this, but a lot of this is really trying to redefine, and not necessarily in a radical way, but I think it pushes us sort of in a different direction like House Bill 678 is. A lot of these proposed changes are trying to get us in alignment with what we feel are those, as Robin mentioned earlier, things we want to keep. Emphasize local board responsibilities. With being responsible, they're also responsible for compliance with statutes and regulations. And I can tell you it's difficult because there are a lot of provide separate processes for emergency projects related to temporary and permanent loss. Unfortunately, we found this out through our friends in Western Kentucky and Eastern Kentucky. The reg just didn't really have much in there. So to their credit, as soon as the floods happened, we have an emergency process in place, but our guys wanted to redefine that so that going forward, if we have another situation, we're ready to go and the regulation's ready to go as well. Procurement of architectural construction management services. This is just some adjustments to the language. This one we actually met with a CM group, if you will, construction manager group. So the 2 million to 5 million threshold, we got quite a bit of pushback from this, to be fair. We have reviewed this a couple of times and looked at the cost of construction. Now, if we go back to, I think, 2013, the last time the CM fees were updated, and that it was 2 million at the time. So we've also looked at Federal Reserve data to figure out, well, where's that 2 million now based on inflation and construction costs? We felt in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 million was reasonable. We also simply asked the question, why is that amount even included? Why are we, setting a threshold? And we've gotten some different answers. One is, no one's really sure, or there's a minimum we felt was, efficient, if you will. But again, trying to read into the tea leaves, if KDE is to sort of get out of the way and let local boards operate with, their own decisions, this is one we struggled with, to be frank, because, on the one hand, we want to provide support, but on the other hand, we don't want to sort of get right in the front of the local board decision. So this is what we're still, I think, internally trying to debate and figure out where's the right spot. Construction manager has constructor option. If you ask me any questions on that, I'm going to have to turn around and hand off the big scoop behind me. Combine some of these processes into one design document process. This gets into the deep weeds of the architectural and construction planning process. And I think we can go to the next slide now. These are some other changes. One is the cooperative purchase agreement, which got a new section, GSC, and this is to get, this is some cleanup. But we also still want that BG1 for GSC, these energy saving contracts. We really want that to be included in the BG1 process. So these are, we can track, and we just got a request not a month or two ago for all the energy saving contract projects. And we get this request, I think, every so often, either outside of government or someone in government or a legislator may want to know how many other districts are doing these projects. Final approval of all change orders will be at the local board level. This was, I think, previously something KDE staff were doing, and this will hopefully accelerate these change order approvals, things like that. And then the BG5 is just clarification. So they'll update KFIX for that inventory classification system, and this will help keep KFIX cleaned as these projects are closed out. It will correspond with KFIX as well. Next slide, please. So the KDE Facility Work Group met not terribly long ago in this very room. And some of these are, really big changes that we feel are not necessarily good or bad, but we would need a little more time to wrap our head around how do we logistically do this. For example, additional fact access and functionality and some of the changes. And these programs take time to change, and that's, we have to prioritize our changes. Unmet need extracurricular. Currently, your football field is not in your unmet need. And that's really a hard question because I think we debated ourselves into a circle about the inclusiveness of an athletic facility as part of the high school experience. And I think we've finally got to some agreement that, you don't drive around and see a high school without these things. So it's part of that bigger project. But including that in the unmet need of your district gets a little different because of the General Assembly's role in this process, which is to provide funding. Space requirements about adequacy and flexibility. Again, one thing we're stressing is personalized professional development. These are big ticket items, and anymore with even the most minor renovations, we want these to be done right and that they last a long time. We want decisions to be made, informed decisions. And not that all districts have ever had trouble, but we've seen issues pop up that, sometimes aren't easily fixed or are very expensive to fix. And in some cases, with any construction, you may just have a bad experience, but the more that we feel that's better path forward. We can go to the next one, please. Yeah.
The one thing I did want to point out, when we met with the work group, we met with them on February 15th, so not too long ago. We have provided the materials if you go out on the KDE website and just in the search function, but it's facilities, it'll pop up the facilities webpage. And on the front of that webpage, at the very top, we have put the summary minutes from that meeting. We put the PowerPoint from that meeting, which really went into a lot more detail than what we provided to you today. And also the recording of the meeting. So you can listen to that conversation between your peers, a lot of superintendents, facility directors, et cetera, about the conversations, which will give you more detail about their feedback that we have on that. Going forward, our intention is to continue to take input and feedback from all interested stakeholders in this process. We would like, if you all go out and review, think about this a little more because we've kind of given you a lot of information today. Think about it a little bit more. If you have suggestions or comments or feedback, if you have a particular thing that just really gripes you about the process right now, and you want to make sure that we hear that, if you could provide that information to either Che or myself. And we will be back in front of you again in June because we want to come back to you again. And by that time, we'll have started working on the regulations themselves. And we will also be going to the Kentucky Board of Education. So whether that's statutory changes, regulatory changes, planning manuals, construction manual, any of that, we appreciate your feedback and input. So let me stop there and see if you have any questions about today's presentation and or our next steps as we move forward.
Okay, open it up to anyone in attendance. Questions?
I have a question with respect possibly and kind of cycling back to what we learned about the buses and what at the point in time when warranty actually started on receipt and completion of that new inspection of that bus. But this goes over to unmet need. And the question is, at what point in time is unmet need considered met? And is that decision regulatory or statutory decision? And because I haven't had time to look that up. And I think what I want to relate it to is with the escalating costs, inflationary costs of these projects as they've grown, obviously, if you filed a BG1 at one point in time and it was for a certain amount for a project, and I think we know that when you file that BG1 historically, your unmet need is reduced at the point in time the BG1 is filed. A lot of people don't know that, to be quite honest with you. I think how that impacts your overall project, especially with inflation, is that something that can be considered? Is it a regulatory decision or is that a statutory decision?
I will have to look at to see if that's internal, like a policy. I know absolutely you're right that the BG1 sort of pulls that need off. And like you said, if that BG1's created a year ago and you're just now kind of getting into the groove of construction and your costs have gone up 30%, 25%, all of a sudden it's eating up your available cash pretty quickly. But we have talked about, I think internally, and it's not a big secret, of revamping how we look at unmet need as longer term and what districts can afford to do, what they cannot afford to do. And I think the more data we have of that, for example, there's some projects that they're just there. They're never going to happen unless you just come into some huge amounts of money. But they're on the DFP, and it's important that everybody knows they're there. But at the same time, taking priority one, priority two, and the way it works now is your priority ones are for the next biennium. A lot of times they may not be addressed. Something else comes up. It happens all the time. Or a board says we don't want to start this project because there's a new highway going in, and we're going to wait for that to finish, and then or consolidation gets people worked up and they back off of it or something like that. So I think re-looking at how we determine what is in that unmet need or refining it to a point that there's different calculations here, priority one, priority two. And the other question we have is what does the General Assembly want to do? We're never going to pay off this unmet need. It's billions and billions and billions. But knowing what Meade County needs or LaRue County needs and what you want to do in the next couple of years, because it's all about that offer from SFCC and what you can obviously do with your local funds as well. So I think it's worth looking into.
Well, and I think your DFP really is a strategic planning document, right? You're trying to really educate your community and the General Assembly and us about what your needs are over a period of time. So you're looking at it very comprehensively. But when you're talking about unmet need, you are really thinking about what do I need now to execute on a project now. And what do I need from the General Assembly now to make it work? So, I'm not sure, maybe we need to look at that in two pieces, the long term and the more immediate short term as far as unmet need. And maybe they're different calculations. Maybe it's a different calculation for what you really feel like you need now versus what you need forever, or to get your complete portfolio up to speed.
And I mean, just a comment that the unmet need across the state, unless you revise your DFP in the last 12 months, the unmet need across the state is probably undervalued by a great
Oh,
extent.
absolutely.
Absolutely. And, communicating that to the legislature, the importance of that, you can't get ahead on it, like you just said. 15, 20 years ago, there was a discussion about having a base down across the state. But those are the kind of conversations that have to happen. We've had many districts, two sitting right here that have tried numerous times for local neighborhood through. We'll never address the unmet need issues unless we have a comprehensive long-term solution to address unmet need. And then I know your staff wants to be able to help communities achieve their goals. And we have to do this comprehensively as a common good. So, but I do appreciate the work in these proposed revisions. Obviously, a lot of work, a lot more flexibility, still complying with all the statutes and regulations, but with really addressing the local code. So, thank you.
I want to add a comment to Superintendent Burchett's question there. One of the things that I know there has to be, we're looking at the cost of projects in the DFP. There's a uniform calculation, a uniform cost for each and every project or each of our square footage. And one of the things that I'd like to see is that to be adjusted, because if you look at the increase in the cost of a project, when we present our DFP to the community, it may say this project will cost 15 million, whereas it really may cost 25 million. I mean, even if we do the bare necessities, that uniform cost across the state seems to be much less than what it would actually cost a district to build a new school, for example. Or at least that was one of the things that I would recommend too. So when we talk about unmet need, we want to make sure our DFP aligns when we present it to our community with the cost that we're projecting for projects. So again, if that could be looked into, I'd appreciate it.
I think that does surprise communities too when they see those two different numbers.
Mm-hmm. And again, that's due in part to the large increase in the cost of construction over the past 4 or 5 years. We've had a school district, just a common one that comes to mind. I'll mention Scott County. As they finished Red Crossing, it was, I want to say, around $60 million, and they went out and bid almost this mirror image building with some minor revisions. It was over 100 million. So that's a $40 million increase in less than 5 years. So do our DFP, the process of calculation, would it match that increase for what a project cost would be? For example, we're trying to build a new elementary school. 5 years ago, we were getting estimates around 17 million. Now we're getting estimates around 27 for the same project. So again, just if that DFP could reflect that. Oh, other questions?
I'd like to make a comment. First of all, as a district that just recently went through the LPC and DFP process, I appreciate the updating manual. And the question I have, did the process of including a finding, did that change at all, or will that still remain the same?
I think there was a conversation somewhere in here about separating finding an amendment a little clearly, making the process a little bit different. Because I think if you're going to do an amendment, it's almost, you might as well just reconvene everything and start all over anyway. The finding itself, I believe, is a lot easier to do.
You don't recall if it's like, because currently I think you can only add one finding at a time, so you'd have to reconvene the DFP each time. That remains the same?
So affecting more than the building. There have been times when finding done one good time at the same meeting. But usually it's one good time. Yeah. No, I mean, if that makes sense. You got
Yeah. And we can also do these finding approvals internal to KDE administratively. So it's a little faster in that regard too. But we can get you a little more information information on that, I think that would help.
That was, okay. Thanks, Greg.
Okay, other questions? Okay, I do have a couple of questions. First of all, a comment. We went through the DFP process recently too, and I want to say thank you for how quickly that approval came back to us. So again, this is something that already we're seeing the benefits of how quickly we can get those and move on with, if we need to go through the nickel process. In our case, we're trying to go through a double nickel, but just because of the cost of construction. We talked a lot about what the group is wanting to retain with House Bill 678. Can you mention specifically what we want to remove from House Bill 678?
Well, I think the one item we hit on was the training.
So that's an addition, not.
There's an addition, really not removing, sorry. I don't really know if there's anything in 678 we talked about, wiping out or, getting back into statute, or we're calling things specific in there. Yeah, I think we sort of embraced what it was trying to do and sort of refined our processes to go along with that. So.
As far as the additional training, I'll have someone that takes care of plant management, but I'll definitely go through the training also too, if that's approved. So I appreciate that. There was a question in there that construction manager and construction option. Can we have a little more explanation?
Sure. For that, I might have to bring Greg up here to explain the construction manager as constructive.
Current regulation have what is called construction manager as advisor. And in that method, construction managers are in a district, and it results in multiple construction contracts, general construction contracts, as many as 25 works project. Same as constructor is frequently referred to as construction manager risk. They're two separate pathways for that to occur. And the one that we're advocating, construction manager's constructor, that results in construction manager providing pre-design services, which include review of the architect's design, materials of constructability, the timelines, those kinds of things. They get project, and then instead of resulting in multiple prime contracts, all those get rolled up, and then that construction manager operates as a general contractor. So there's only one. For the district, it provides much less paperwork, if you will, because of the number of contracts to deal with. It provides more accountability as construction manager, as advisor. The CM bonds only its fee, and the other CMC, they bond total project cost. There are pros and cons for that. For those that operate under CMA, they can do more projects because their bonding capacity can cover that. CMC, that directly affects their bottom line, how many projects they can do. As an aside, the other CM at risk is not, in my opinion, having done these in private practice, does not lend itself to public agency usage. So we push back on that in the past. Does that explain what you're asking? And I understand the context under which you asked the question about what.
I've heard it stated, just in common sense terms, is it gives the districts one throat to choke or one hand to shake. And, we've got to be wise stewards of the taxpayer dollar while we're trying to accomplish what the community has charged us with doing. And, I appreciate Ritter, appreciate your all staff and work that's going on here to try to move through these issues. So,
Thank you.
a lot of really good work. I'm excited about the changes. It hopes 3 or 4 years ago, we started having some of these discussions that we're moving in this direction. So thank you.
And want to thank all the folks that worked on this. And there's been superintendents as part of this work too. So we want to thank each superintendent's been a part of this and also each member. Other questions from the group?
We can go right through for the next item.
Well, at this time, if there's no other questions, let's take about a 10-minute recess. Well, I tell you, let's convene back at 11, if everyone would please, and that way, the last agenda item, I understand, is fairly long. So let's be back here by 11, please.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And in our final area of the agenda, we have Associate Commissioner Sims and Division Director Stafford, as well as representatives from the Center for Assessment, provide an overview of the accountability standard setting process that LSAC will participate in this year. So,
Good morning, Bill. My pleasure to be with you. We appreciate some time on the agenda today. Also, want to share some information, some upcoming plans for some important work this summer, but we more importantly want to engage you in some thoughts around the process. And we did provide some information, obviously, in advance. Our team from the Center for Assessment is going to go through that in just a minute. But I have learned, as I'm sure you have in your careers, it's important to have a good team of people around you. And so I'm going to turn to Jennifer Stafford, who's going to give you a little bit of highlight, and then we'll move to our other partners that are part of that team.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. In 2020, prior to the pandemic, Senate Bill 158 was passed and signed into law, and it changed our accountability system from what we previously had. It brought in two components, status and change. And status was reported last year. We set standards using a process where we brought in stakeholders, educational leaders, and that committee made recommendations both to KDE and to LSAC. This year, we have to hold a similar process because we are bringing in that second component of the accountability system change. So the status is the current year performance, and the change is the difference between the indicators between the prior year and the current year. So we want to have a process for accountability recommendations from our accountability standard setting committee that will bring recommendations to both KDE and LSAC for approval. We want, before that, to get your guidance and some direction on some key policies that will influence the direction of that policy and that recommendation of how we hold that accountability standard. So at this point, I'll introduce Brian Gong and Laura Pinso from the Center for Assessment. They are going to provide us some introductions as well as some guidance on how they are planning to design and facilitate the upcoming standard set. Chris Domleski is a part of the process, but I do not believe he is here with us today. Brian and Laura.
And I see they're on the screen, so.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? All right, I see some nodding heads, so we will continue here. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for having us again. My name is Laura Pensino. I am an associate at the Center for Assessment, and I was one of the team of 3 from the center who was helping to facilitate the standard setting process that was conducted last September. So I'm happy to be here again with you today. I'll turn it over to my colleague, Brian, so he has an opportunity to introduce himself as well.
Good morning, glad to be here and looking forward to having the input from this important and statutorily established group today. Thank you.
So as you can see, we're planning to spend some time today looking back a little bit as a way of setting some context for the plans for this coming year in terms of that standard setting process that Rhonda and Jennifer mentioned. And then we importantly want to spend some time posing some questions to you to get your responses that will inform the work going forward. If you could advance the slide, please. So in addition to kind of sharing just a quick review of how we conducted the event last year, the standard setting process, and importantly, what we learned there, we want to make sure that we review the proposed approach that we're pursuing for this year's process, which we believe account for some of the lessons learned last year. I definitely want to mention that if we skip down to number 3 there, we'll be meeting with you all again on May 30th. So the plans for today are unfolding, and we expect that in a couple months we'll have more details to offer. But as I mentioned, we have some questions to pose to you, and that the guidance that you provide and that we've heard from KDE will kind of collectively inform how we structure the standard setting process and how we engage with the panelists. If you could go to the next slide, please. So let's start by looking back, and we'll go ahead to the next slide. Thank you. So it's important to start with our principles for accountability standard setting. We need to remind ourselves sort of some of the best practices here. So it's the procedures that we follow seek, of course, to comply with legal requirements and reflect the policy priorities that you all and KDE have established. We want to make sure that we involve a representative panel with persons who have appropriate expertise to engage in the process. That was very successful last year. And noting that we had a couple of your members, Ms. Mitchell and Dr. Fletcher, participated in the panel. And we expect their participation again this year, I believe. We want to make sure that we have a structured judgmental process. We want to have clear definitions for performance. We want to have data to inform the process. We want to collect feedback along the way. And we want to make sure we're well documented and transparent. So these are the general principles that inform the conversations we're having as we look ahead to how to structure the standards setting in light of what's new in the system this year. If we could go advance the slide, please. Thank you. So some of you may remember last year we had, I'm just going to go ahead and call it a whirlwind of a process. So we had a very representative panel, 26 members who were able to participate. And we had a day and a half in which we discussed how to describe performance. So that's establishing those performance level descriptors in the system. We had, within that day and a half, panelists established indicator cuts. So that was for the status component specifically, and panelists established overall cuts for that system. This was a lot. And less than a week after that, we convened with you all and with KDE to discuss the recommendations from the process and from the panelists for your review and ultimately approval. So obviously this was a lot to do in a day and a half, but and we would say that the process was overall successful, but certainly we had some lessons learned. So if you could advance the slide, please. These lessons are feedback from our own reflections, from you all, what we heard from you when we were able to convene with you last year, as well as from our colleagues at KDE. And so it's one, certainly goes perhaps without saying, but it's important to plan for complexity and scope of the tasks that are at hand. And the good news is that we have more time to do that this year. And so time is sort of a theme in some of the lessons learned in terms of building in sufficient time for preparation, for training, for support, sufficient time for discussion and judgment amongst the panelists within the process, sufficient time for you all, for LSAC, to review the recommendations prior to discussing. So that's certainly a theme. We also want to make sure we have time to establish clear and coherent performance level descriptors. Those definitions of performance were really important for the panelists as they engaged in the part of the process where actually establishing those performance thresholds, the cut scores. And so we want to make sure we have sufficient time to establish those PLDs. And we want to make sure we have a representative panel still, because all of that helps contribute to the credibility of the process, which is ultimately paramount. Folks can accept the recommendations from the panel more easily when they believe that the process was well organized and well implemented. And ultimately, that's our goal. So if we could advance. So again, we would say last year went well, given the constraints that we had. And as we look ahead to this year, the complexity increases significantly, and yet we also have some more time on our hands. So this is the good news, bad news slide. And again, between today and the May meeting, we're going to illustrate how we're addressing some of these lessons. So as a way of background, we do want to quickly review just some of the components of the system when we're thinking about what we're going to ask our panelists to engage in. So we're going to review some of those components. We're going to consider the panelists' tasks, and then we'll kind of examine the high-level plan for the standard setting before I pass it off to Brian. So if we could go to the advanced slide, please. Thank you. So when we think about the accountability reports, these reports are going to present status outcomes, basically the outcome of whatever the metric is for each indicator, in addition to the change outcome for each indicator. And as Jennifer mentioned, change is that difference in your status score from the current year, between the current year and the prior year. So that's why we didn't have change last year and we have change this year. Ultimately, there is an indicator performance rating and an overall performance rating. And the next slides will kind of show you what that will look like in some of the reports. So if we could advance, please. So this is a sample indicator report. We're looking at the indicator for reading and mathematics, and you can see some of the layers of information that are presented. And it's important to have a sense of that because it helps you understand what our panelists need to kind of hold in mind during this process and what we're going to be asking them to address. So you can see there's a directly below that title for the indicator, you can see the status options and the change options. And then within the box on the right-hand side, in this particular example, middle school has an indicator rating of yellow, their status was medium, and their change was maintained. So as a reminder, or just in case this is new to you, the status ratings range from very high, high, medium, low, and very low. And the range for the change ratings start at increased significantly, increased, maintained, decreased, and decreased significantly. So that's the language that is associated with the status and change ratings. If we advance the slide, you'll see an example here of what a school is going to see. So here's that middle school, and this presents indicator outcomes. So we don't see the change in status here, but we do see the indicator performance ratings, which range from blue to red, as I think you're familiar with, for the indicators that are applicable to that school. And then if we could advance. A school also has an overall performance rating, which is reflective of the aggregation across indicators. And so in this case, we could see that this middle school, and as an example, has an overall performance rating in the orange category. If we could advance the slide. So what we're going to ask our standard setting panel to engage in is, in addition to, again, reviewing and establishing the descriptors of performance, those performance level descriptors, they're going to be setting cut scores for these components of the system, specifically defining the levels of status, again, from very high to very low, defining the levels of change from increase significantly to decline significantly. And then looking at overall performance, and again, all of this is by grade span, establishing the thresholds for those 5 levels of overall performance from blue to red. That's the ask within the standard setting component, which is layered on to those descriptions of performance that we're going to ask the panel to be able to define. We could advance, please. So we want to look at the standard setting plan. So we've started by looking back at last year, reflecting on what worked in that process, where there were lessons learned. We consider the principles that are important in any standard setting process, and the tasks that we have for our panelists, as well as the timeline before us. So we kind of take all of those things and start to generate more specific plans for what this will look like for the panel in 2023. We could advance the slide, please. Um, we started this process back in the beginning of the calendar year in January, starting to kind of craft and consider what are the tasks, what are some of the details, what are ways to approach the standard setting in the light of the fact that we have status and change this year. If you could advance one more, please. Here we are in March, seeking important policy guidance from KDE and this group. And if you could advance one more time, importantly, we get to acknowledge that we're planning to have separate events for the establishment of the performance level descriptors and the actual standard setting. So in June is when we're going to convene the panel to define performance at the different levels for status, change, and overall performance. And then we'll reconvene the panel in September for the actual standard setting workshop in which they will employ those descriptions of performance as they are setting those thresholds that define the different categories for status and change. And then between September and we'll have into October for us to at the center to kind of to draft the the report for the process and to provide the recommendations to you all and to KDE for review and approval. So hopefully a key takeaway for you is that there is more time, that we're able to separate the process and each of the kind of major components in terms of defining performance and setting those cut scores can kind of have their due time and space for conversation. So as we think about the standard setting plan, again, based on our experiences, what we've heard from you all, as well as advice from the Kentucky Technical Advisory Committee, with whom we've met to discuss this back in November of last year and in February of this year, we have some guidelines. We really want to try to keep the process as simple as is appropriate, recognizing that if the plan gets too complex, it just increases the cognitive load for panelists in a process that is already has a lot to kind of keep track of. And so we really want to try to keep the process as simple as possible so folks can focus on the question before them. We want to make sure that ultimately the system is able to detect meaningful progress in schools. We want to make sure that it can give meaningful information to you all and to school leaders and the public. But we also want it to be appropriately reliable. So we want to avoid, that means that we're going to avoid approaches to implementing this change, this new component of the indicators that would be unlikely to move the needle. So we want to think about kind of how we incorporate change in the system in a way that adds value and information for the folks who are interacting with the accountability system. And again, going back to even to our principles that I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure that the system reflects the policy values and your guidance. You could advance, please. So that big difference this year, of course, is change in the indicators. Not that the indicators are changing, but they are because we're bringing change into them. So we mentioned already that change is defined as the difference in status scores, really. And I already talked about the categories, but what will be important here is just acknowledging that last year, the standard setting panelists spent time thinking about status, discussing how we describe status, the different status ratings, and actually setting those cut scores. This year, we're asking them, in addition to that, to also think about what different amounts of change mean and how we characterize that in the system. So we're going to have to make space for that in the process. Let's look at the proposed approach then. So in June, the plan is to, that's where we're going to have more than a day to develop and approve the performance level descriptors. And so this is where we're going to say, all right, let's make sure we're defining and describing performance at the different rating levels for status in a way that we can all agree with. Let's look at how we're discussing the different change ratings and how we describe what those ratings mean. Let's look at how we describe overall performance for a school given the aggregation of indicators that are in play. And so we're going to be able to take that time and really sit with those descriptions in June with the panel. In September, we will focus on those layers of the system. So we're going to ask our panelists to establish the status cut scores for each indicator. We're going to ask them to establish change cut scores for each indicator. And all of that happens by grade span, as you, I think, know. We're going to kind of check back against, we're going to look at status and change and make sure that aligns with indicator performance ratings. And then we're going to look at overall school profiles. And those will be used to establish the overall performance ratings. So that's where those cuts are set at an overall school level. And again, we'll have a coherence check. How's this all looking in light of what we said about status and change? We kind of have that through line to examining school level performance. And these, we've kind of listed it out stepwise here, but it's important to note that in the June workshop, as well as in the September workshop, all of these steps are structured around individual review time, small group discussion, and full group discussion. So are kind of layers of interaction where individuals bring their expertise and reflection. They also have opportunity to share that and learn from their peers and adjust their judgment if they feel that that's appropriate over a course of sort of different stages of the process. So I want to acknowledge that that's how we're building in some of the lessons learned around the need for just making sure we have sufficient time for discussion and judgment. After the September workshop, and we noted this on that timeline slide, that's where we would be producing that summary report draft, which conveys the recommendations from the panelists. There's time for KDE and you all to review that, and then there would be ultimately a discussion for related to the recommendations and hopefully approval as well. So that's the proposed approach. As I mentioned, we're looking forward to convening with you in a couple of months. We would, at that time, have kind of more detail for some of the steps in the process, but wanted to make sure you had an understanding here in the end of March about kind of where the plan stands, what the priorities are, and what we're going to be asking the panelists to do. So before I pass it off to Brian to pose some of the policy questions we have for you, I do want to pause and see if there are any questions or reflections that you have about this proposed process. And thank you for the time.
No, that's back up.
Superintendent Borchers, you have a question?
Sir, you're muted.
There we go. I just have a few, Superintendent Fletcher. So let me get this straight. We're changing the cut scores again for the different levels. Is that correct for each student?
These are not student level cut scores, so this is different than the what we would consider an assessment standard setting process, where you're looking at those performance levels on the state assessments. This is at the accountability system where we're summarizing performance at a school or group level. And but yes, there is a revisiting of a process that happened last year. So last September, cut scores were set for status for the accountability system because the state needed to produce accountability results last year. That was a requirement, but their change component wasn't ready yet because you didn't have those 2 years. So the standard setting panel that met last year set cuts last year. This year, we will ask them to set cuts, this time also including change. We will present the 2022 status cuts to them as a starting point, and it would certainly be fine if what they said was, those were the cuts we set and we don't need to change those status cuts, but we still need to, at the very least, establish change cuts. And then because there's this whole new component in the system, that does mean that, yeah, we have to ask folks to look at those overall performance ratings as well.
Okay, so my question might be better phrased then. So if I had a score last year and I'm that same school, same level, and I get the same score this year, it could either go up or down based on where the cut scores are. Is that correct?
Your overall rating could have a different label for the same numerical score between the 2 years, but the numerical score means something different because it includes change in addition to status.
Okay, let's just look at status then. So,
Okay.
so my status, if my status was green last year, and now it could be green this year, and the score could be different. Is that could possibly happen, correct?
There is a possibility that could happen because panelists were told last year there would be a process this year, a standard setting process where they would look at status and change. It is also possible that panelists have the opportunity to say, we don't want to change any of the status cuts that we set last year.
Okay, so that's what I was getting at then. If the status cuts are changed, then how can you compare a change score if you're comparing different status cuts? And I guess my concern would be, the other part of that would be, let's say I'm a blue school and I stayed very similar, but I have a red school and it stays very similar. So the change scores are going to be even and they get considered the same credit if I didn't move anything out of red and I didn't move anything out of blue. How are we going to filter through that?
Yeah, so there's a couple layers to what you just said that I want to address. So first of all, if the status cut scores are, even if those change, the change score is based on the numerical difference in status scores. It's not based on a change. The change score is not based on a change in status rating. It's based on a change in status score. So we're not saying your change score is based on going from red to orange or from blue to green or something like that. It's based on what your numerical score was and the difference. So where the cuts are set for status don't impact what your change score is. They may impact what your status rating is. The change score then is what we're asking the standard setting panel to examine and say, we're going to present them with data and say, how do we define what amount of change we would characterize as maintaining? How do we define what amount of change, what change score range we would consider to be increasing or increasing significantly? So it is important to kind of, I want to be clear that the change score is just based on changes in status scores. The change score is independent of the status rating. But the panelists have an opportunity in the process to say, when we look at change, maybe there's not a lot of change that we actually see. And so that's going to influence and inform how we decide to define what we consider to be change that is reflective of an increase versus change that is reflective of maintaining performance versus change that is reflective of declining. So it really is up to the panelists to kind of use their judgment and to learn from one another and use their collective judgment to set those ranges of change scores that fall in the different categories. So I hope those kind of layers make sense, Brian.
An example might help, and I think we'll go through in just a minute. So, Superintendent, I think you're raising two really important questions, and this is what we've come to LSAC to get input on. So maybe I can give an example that will help show how status and change work, and then I'll repose the questions that I heard you ask. Chair Fletcher, are there additional questions or comments?
I do have a question. We've talked about indicator performance level descriptors. We've talked about overall level descriptors. The one thing we haven't talked about is all this is based on the cut scores for apprentice, proficient, distinguished, novice, all those cut scores. So I guess my question is, will there be changes in the percentages of questions that need to be answered correctly in order to get a proficient or distinguished or novice or apprentice? Because all of this, all these indicators that's been described are going to be based on proficiency.
So let me weigh in on that one if you don't mind, and then Brian and Laura may want to add. We did bring teachers together last year to do a validation of science. And then they also looked at all of the other tests as the assessments were new. They did not make decisions though on the percentage. The percentage was feedback or like impact data. But the decision is based on the student work and how that lines up to a novice student should be able to do this. Those descriptions of things they can do, apprentice, proficient, distinguished. We did not, with the pandemic, with flooding, we didn't have as many teachers participate in those panels as we really ideally would like to have to get a good representative sample all across Kentucky. So we feel like we need to come back and do just a validation of the cuts. We don't expect movement of the cuts. We think the cuts were right, but we feel like to be really confident and to make sure that we don't have later someone say, well, I don't think you had enough teachers to have that conversation. We really think it's important to do a validation. So we are seeking teachers now, and your DACs may have been involved with that. Jennifer's been out talking about it. We've had information going out to our DAC advisory and to other DACs, looking for some teachers to be involved with that process. It's virtual. So can I tell you there would be absolutely no possibility of any change? I cannot, because you're bringing people together to sort of look and revalidate. But we do think it is an important step that we let that validation happen. Now, this is similar in a way to the conversation I think we just had around the idea of, are you going to look at status from last year and accountability? So to just sort of, I guess, put it all together, the novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished, how every kid performs on every test. We don't expect those to shift, but we will bring teachers together to go through a validation process. They won't go through science again because science was a validation to begin with last year and no change was recommended. And science standards have just been reset. So I think one thing you have to keep in mind is we have a system that is very defined in statute, that we have to have status, we have to have change, and we have to bring it in with these particular labels. I think another piece of that, though, is we have things in statute that say every 6 years, you're going to look at the standards for reading, math, science, social studies, all the things we assess. So every 6 years, those academic standards might change. Then you may have changes because of that happen to the assessment, and you'll have to go through the process of NAPD. So I think you have to understand, based on what's in state law, there's not the ability that it becomes carved in stone on a particular day. But you have to, I think, honor a quality, transparent process to say, did we get things wrong? So we do believe that we need to have a validation. When we talked to our Kentucky Technical Advisory Panel, they recommended that we bring teachers back together. So it would be a virtual experience and won't come together in person. So let me pause and see if you have questions about that piece, because that would happen, I think we're tentatively, that's in June.
First week of June.
It's the first week of June. I'm thinking teachers now. Jennifer, feel free to chime in.
I'll also note that there is a statutory language that the department release items as well as statistics every year. And those released items were released in October. So with those released items, because we lose those items, we have to replenish those and we have to bring forward new items. So in the assessments this spring that the students we are preparing for and are working with our DACs and our BACs, there will be additional items in the test called field test items. Those items are not part of the operational piece or they don't go into the score, but they are field tested so that they can eventually replace those released items that we are losing annually.
So I want us to not use the word change, but your ongoing have to have this issue of kind of replenishing the test, releasing and replenishing. You wouldn't go back and reset NAPD. each time. You get those cuts. We think this is just one more look at it. Again, not anticipating really shifting it to something. So let me pause there and see if that conversation between us brought up any additional questions or your comments from.
Yeah, to follow up on that with NAPD, with those cut scores for students. Now, I'm not talking about the indicators, the performance level indicators. Is there some type of nationally norm comparison data that we're doing with NAEP or with other things to validate or to give more validity to our process to say, okay, this is what a novice score should be. So what kind of comparative data are we using to set NAPD for those individual cut scores?
I would need to go back and look at the actual standard setting plan, the standard validation. We did not use any national norm data last year. For after the cuts were actually done, after we got to the process of looking at the final report, we reviewed that with the commissioner. We did go back and just look at, not to make the decisions were already made, but we looked at some formative information. We looked at NWEA, which is not everybody. Some people use that. Some people use iReady. We looked at just where those predictions were when you look at your formative information. And they really lined up very closely. So I don't know what you experienced at your school if you looked at your formative kinds of systems, if that was pretty close to what you ended up with in the state, but holistically as a state, it was close. So I would say we used some other data really to just do kind of a final face check to see how things lined up. We did not use any national norm data as part of the process of setting state. But we did look at it behind the scenes, but it was really looking just at those formative kinds of results. Because we've had, even though we don't have state contracts, we've had companies, because there's been research interest around COVID and COVID recovery, that we're able to share some information with us, because we don't really see your results when you buy a formative product. We're not having access to your formative data, but they were able to share just some general looks for the state. And so we did do that behind the scenes.
So essentially your teachers, the group that's on the NAPD's cut scores, they look at the overall, they don't see any individual schools, neither did the group, the 26-member accountability group. And then what they did was they said, okay, this is where would make sense based on our research, our data, that this would be the cut point for novice. This would be the cut point for apprentice. And when you're dealing with multiple choice tests, usually that's a percentage of questions that are correct.
And what we do put together, and we can certainly get you a copy of the report from last year for those of you who have greater interest. We do have a process that's vendor led. So Pearson is our primary vendor for the assessment. And we use an order item booklet process, I'm pretty sure, with this. So items are put together based on kind of performance and difficulty, looking actually at how kids perform. And again, the teachers aren't seeing anything that says this is how this district performs, or this district, or even this group of students. What they're seeing is a body of student work. So like if it's an extended response item, they're seeing, here's an example of a novice kind of performance, of apprentice, of proficiently distinguished. And they're also seeing kind of also the difficulty level of the multiple choice. And so really, if you were doing it non-electronic, you used to put them together in a book. And you would actually put, an order mark for when you think you've achieved novice. And this is where the move is from novice to apprentice, apprentice to proficient. And it is very teacher grounded, because you're using the folks that are most close to the classroom instruction and daily seeing kids work. So it is a very teacher driven process. Now they do get to see impact data, much like you all saw. So they do get to see an impact data. If I put my cut here, what does that mean for the percentage of students that might fall into those categories? So that's just part of the information, I think.
And the reason why I added that was Superintendent Borchers, the number that you get for status this year could be the same number, or for next year could be the same one that you got for this year, but they don't exactly mean the same thing. Because if the novice apprentice performance distinguished cut points change, then that number may or may not mean the exact same thing. Hopefully it doesn't, but it could. Does that help? Superintendent Borchers?
And then.
Yeah, and that's I guess that's what my biggest concern is. And Rhonda, I know we've been doing this for a long time, is we just came out of a pandemic last year. We were kind of able to understand, and now we're going to be changing up again this year. That just seems very difficult for our teachers and our folks across the state, that we don't even when this is all said and done in October, we're not even going to be able to say, well, based on last year's scores, we know we did this. If those cut scores stay the same, we can do that. But if they change, there's no rhyme or reason to be able to say that, well, we grew or we didn't grow, because we grew based on how things transferred over. I just think it's a really difficult time, and I would caution everybody doing too many changes, coming out of the pandemic and then getting ready to redo a standard. I understand the 6-year rules, and I understand all of those things. I just think if we could have a year that could be consistent, and maybe just leave those scores where they are for this year to see how that pans out, we could really, really have a true change model. And maybe that's the most important thing this year, is that's where you were when you came out of the pandemic. Here's how much improvement or lack of improvement you had in a year. And maybe that's the discussion point versus trying to reorganize the whole and then take the third year to redo that. That's just a thought. And now I'll shut up. I promise I won't say anything again.
That's not a promise you need to make, and that one will enforce, but appreciate the point.
Questions. One about validation process. Can you explain about the specific process that teachers went to make that determination of why they were valid or how they were valid? Then the next question really links to when we approved those standards for science, I guess a couple months ago. One of the questions that I specifically asked was, how do the regular standards compare, and is there a crosswalk to the AP standards for our AP students? I'm really sitting back to Superintendent Fletcher's comment just about really the validation of that and how they compare, what data was used in order. Really, is there a crosswalk or going to be a crosswalk for our teachers to really look and use, so that we are adequately making sure that our AP advanced students are prepared? I did a lot of research within my own district around the performance levels of the students in Anderson County and how they specifically relate to AP scores and those upper courses for AP Physics, AP Bio, just a lot of those students and how they scored on the state assessment, the KSA versus ACT. And so how was that process? What I found was that process really looked as if the KSA was harder than some of the performance that I expected. I expected a lot more distinguished and proficient students versus what I found. And the students that were scoring higher on those AP exams for physics and bio and all of those AP courses, as well as their ACT scores, are in the 30s. So is there a crosswalk? 1, 2, with the process of I guess the validation? What did that look like in comparison to were there AP teachers on there? There's just a lot of questions around that validation process that I still have, because what I think I heard was that validation process was done last year and it's not going to be revisited for 6 more years. So the concerns that I still have, and I know I shared those, with you all a couple of months ago, I still have those same concerns now based on what I just heard as far as, the performance of our students last year, their overall comparative scores on ACT and AP pass rates, and how they perform on the KSA.
Let me kind of unpack them a little bit. A couple of things. I want to make sure we're clear in the term we're using, validation. Typically, standard setting, if you call something a standard setting, you're kind of starting with the ability of teachers to move around the cuts quite a bit. They can look at it, they're setting the first cut, they can move it around to say, here's where novice stops, apprentice begins. When we talk about validation in this context, it's saying that really you're looking at the cut and you're confirming. And if you're moving anything, you really need a really sound piece of evidence that is in all agreement among teachers to move. So that's why, a moment ago, when I think it was Sheriff Fletcher said, or maybe it was Superintendent Borchers, are these all going to change? Because we're calling it a validation, we're saying, look at where it is. Look at how it lines up to the student work. Is this something that there is a legitimate concern that it needs to shift? So validation is more limiting in terms of how the change of the cuts might happen than standard setting. So that's how I'm using those terms in this context. Now, when we talk about science, the science standards have just been completed. So the new science standards are ready to go into place. Now, I don't think there's dramatic difference, but it does mean because new standards have been completed, we'll need to go back and look at the current science test against the new Kentucky standards and say, is this still lining up appropriately? And because we're releasing items and new items have to come in, as if that test significantly changes, then we'll need to revisit novice, apprentice, proficient, etc. But it won't be 6 years from now because we've just finished that process of the new standards being done. Our Office of Teaching and Learning has mainly done that work. So I would say as soon as we get the new test lined up to those new standards, that's when you would maybe do a revisit of those cuts. So you're looking at a year or two out, not like 6 years out, because we're already at the end of that 6-year process of getting standards. So the issue, though, of really where we started of using a national normed assessment to sort of set the standards, we did not do that, even with science. We have had various times where we have used some data. I'll give you an example. Many of you, because you've been around like we have for a while, you remember we did end of course testing. And when we did end of course, that was an ACT test. It was a purchase test. And we looked at how it tracked ACT because it was being produced by the same company. There was a lot of overlap of content. KSA and ACT has quite a bit of differences and the focus of science around it. And so they don't align just tight because there are differences in the actual content that's measured around those two programs. Now, again, we do not have, I don't believe we have in the current plan, a look at comparing that to that outside kind of source. Now, we can certainly go back and have conversations about that, but that has not been used. Kentucky has what's called a criterion reference model, where you're linking everything to the content standards of the state. So we have not used in a really defined way at how you perform a national test. Now, I think another question you had was, do we have AP teachers as part of the process? We try to get good balanced representation. So hopefully somebody would have been someone who had AP experience. We can certainly go back and look at that. We're still putting committees together for the other content areas and the next round of science. We can do that same sort of thing. But I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, did we actually have people who were also AP type teachers?
The most important comment that I want to make is that crosswalk is critical to helping the districts understand the expectations of the KSA so that we're able to make sure that regardless of whether they're in a regular science course, an AP course, or preparing for the ACT, that they're prepared for all.
Sure.
Because the instruction that should happen at the district level should really prepare our children for any exam that they're able to take and should be able to proficiently do it quite well. It really shouldn't matter if it's a KSA, an AP, or an ACT. So that crosswalk, I think, will be critical in helping the districts plan for curriculum alignment, just deconstructing those standards and preparing to ensure that our students are well prepared regardless of what exam that they're taking.
Sure.
I think with having AP teachers on there, my recommendation or suggestion might be is that we at least look at that population because they are highly qualified, highly trained teachers that are very, very knowledgeable regardless of whether it's an AP course or physics or and integrated science, it doesn't really matter. Those folks would, would be valuable on that committee. Is my
And we
suggestion.
certainly would not have disengaged a teacher because they were AP. It's just not knowing the makeup of everyone.
Understand.
We can certainly make buzz of it. We'll also take these comments back and talk with OTL as well as teaching and learning to do more around the support of the instruction piece. So I think these are very valid, good comments for you to raise with us today.
I do want to do that you did put in the chat that there's not going to be a crosswalk between the Kentucky Academic Standards for Science and the coursework, that they do have an added glance document that details what standards have been revised, added, or shifted. She intends to share that with me so that I can pass along to all of the LSAC.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for weighing in there. So I'll pause and we may have.
I just have a comment. It may be in the future, and you may have already shared this, but maybe reshare what that process for ensuring that the teacher group determining the NAPD cut scores is a representative distribution of professionals from across the state and all of our diverse communities, and in all areas, as Ms. Mitchell was speaking to.
Just like you have a need on some teachers that have special education patterns.
Absolutely.
And so you need all of that. And I think you work with English learners, you need a mix.
I think some of that kind of maybe reared its head in that 1.5 day standard setting.
When you were talking.
Last year, once we got through some of that conversation, and so, we've got a responsibility to get this right. We have to communicate this and to the public. And where the rubber meets the road is where we do that as superintendents and education leaders in the state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, any more questions? I think Dr. Gone was going on, sorry.
Well, go ahead and let Brian. Go ahead, Brian.
Brian, if you wouldn't mind, I think you said you had some examples, may help us with questions. So if you want to move forward with that,
Yes.
then we'll next questions again.
Okay, great. If we could go to the next slide. As you can tell, much of this standard setting for accountability systems is guided by policy. And so we're going to talk about some key policies, and we're coming to LSAC because there are some policies that we would like your guidance about. So some of these policy decisions have been made by the Kentucky Board of Education. For an example is they establish weights for how much each indicator counts when it's being combined into an overall score. And the Board of Education also provided guidance for how status and change should be combined into an overall performance rating. And I'm going to review those and then come to the guidance that we would like your input on today. If we could go to the next slide, please. So there are weights that each indicator has. They differ by grade level. They were used in 2022 when we were combining the indicators, just the status part of indicators, and they're going to be used again in 2023, but they will include status and change. And of course, the addition of change is the new part, and as Laura showed, an indicator performance rating combines how the school did on status, how it did in the most recent year, and change, how much his performance changed from this year from last year. So if we go to the next slide, these are the weights that were approved by the Kentucky Board of Education for each of the indicators. So just reading the first row to make sure we're all understand how to read it. For elementary schools, there are 4 indicators. The first is state assessments in reading and math, and that has a 51% weight. The second indicator is other state assessment results, science, social studies, and writing, that has a 40% weight. You can tell together those add up to 91%. So the remaining 9% was allocated to English learner progress, 5%, and quality of school, climate, and safety, 4%. The weights for middle school are pretty similar, not exactly the same. And then high school are quite different because high school has 6 indicators: graduation rate and post-secondary readiness. And again, these are the weights that are provided. So if you take the school's score and you multiply it by these weights, and it'll add up to 100. So those weights have been used before, and those won't change. Those were set by the board. Can we do the next? Oh, let me just pause and see if there are any questions about that.
Not this time. Go ahead.
Okay, great. The next part is new. This is the question about if you have status and you have a change rating, how do you get an overall, in what's called an indicator performance rating? And this is what the board issued. This is the guidance the board had. So down the left are the 5 different levels of status, going from very high to very low. Now, if someone said, what is very high? The answer is, that is what the standard setters this summer are going to define. The board just said, if there's very high, whatever the standard setters set in status, and the school change score was declined significantly, then that school will get a yellow on the indicator performance rating. So that's how this table works. The first row is very high status, and then there are 5 possible change ratings, from decline significantly on the left to change increased significantly on the right. And so what this table says is that a school with very high status in the current year, if it declined significantly, it will have a yellow rating for whatever the indicator is. So let's say we're talking about reading and math. If the change declined, then it would be green. Anything else, it would be blue. And then you can read the other rows similarly. So if we do the bottom row, a school that had very low status in the current year will have a red overall if its change is maintained or declined significantly. If it increases, if the change is increased, then it will have a rating of orange, and then we'll have a yellow if it increased significantly. So those are that's the guidance that the board had. They issued this table of combining status and change, and they provided one table for all the indicators. There's not a different table for different indicators. The standard setters are charged with defining what change decline significantly means, or change declined means, what the score is that defines that. And those can differ by indicator. In fact, we're going to ask you whether they should be even more sensitive to the status level. So anyway, this is the guidance from the Board of Education, on the State Board of Education, on how status and change are combined to give a color rating for each indicator. Is there any, and Rhonda, if I've forgotten when this was guidance was issued by the board. It was a couple of years ago. Is that correct?
I think it was December of 2020 was when the regulation was processed.
Okay.
Pretty sure it was September of 2020, and they talked about it for several board meetings.
Okay. Are there any questions about this part about combining status and change?
One question. My question really is with the determination of the status in the current year is going to be for the state assessment taken in the spring. Is that correct?
So this year it will be spring 23. That's correct, the current year.
So then down the side, every school will determine will be determined on what their current status here is. And there's only a
Yes,
go across linearly, correct? So for example, if one of my schools that's high status in current year is in what they achieve in the spring is high status, they have the opportunity to go across instead of up. Is that correct?
that's correct. So there was the discussion earlier about will the status cut scores, what will the cut scores that define what it takes to be very high status change? And there were two parts of that. One was, will the NAPDs change? So you've already discussed that. The other is, could the standard setters change the cut scores that were established last year? And the answer to can they change? The answer is yes, because that question was brought up last year. I think Superintendent Fletcher Mitchell remember this, and the standard setters were told at the last year that they would have a chance to review the cut scores this year with the new data and decide whether they wanted to change them. As Superintendent Boucher is pointing out, if you change them, then it's going to be hard to compare them with last year. But people may say, we do want to change them or don't want to change them. Let me just give an example of how the accountability cut scores are different than the assessment cut scores. So last year, the standard setters recommended and KDE and LSAC approved a cut score for what a would take to get a high, so a high status. And the high status was around 65 on the. Those of you familiar with the NAPD, you get 50 points for apprentice and 100 points for proficient, 125 for distinguished, and so it creates a weighted average. And so if you had all of your students proficient, the score would get an index score in reading and math of 100. If it had all of its students apprentice, it would have an index score of 50. So the cut score that was approved last year was 65. If the students were half apprentice and half proficient, the school would get a score of 75. So the cut score for a high status in Kentucky, if those aren't changed, will be a little bit less than half of the students apprentice and half proficient. So there'll be more students, more than 50% apprentice and fewer than 50% proficient. That's the cut score. So people are asking, sort of, what's the national norm? That's a separate part than what these cut scores are. Someone just said, we think this proportion of apprentice to proficient is what we want to call a high status in Kentucky. And the part of the reason for that is they knew the percentiles. That's the 76th percentile, when it's higher than 75% of the schools in the state as of last year. So people said that seems that's high enough to call that high. So we will review all of this with the standard setters. They will know what the scores mean. If there are any changes in the NAPD, that'll be very transparent to people, and they can make adjustments if they want. They'll know if they change it, it will make it close to impossible to compare it back to last year. So so we'll inform people completely about this, but there was the promise made that standard setters would be able to review the status scores. Now I'm going to ask the status for cuts. So one of the questions we want to ask LSAC is, do you have guidance about under what conditions you would recommend the standard setters consider making changes in the status scores? So you could say, we want it, keep it as consistent as possible to support comparisons across years. You might say, make adjustments to make it so that if there are any changes in NAPDs from the assessment standard setting, we'd like that to be taken into account so that we can try to make them as comparable as possible. That's our first question to you: is what guidance do you have about these status cut scores that were set last year and will be reconsidered this year?
Another way to make sure that I understand. Are we comparing, can you define change and how we're comparing change on this model? Is it from, so for example, if I have a medium school this year currently, and they change to high status next year, am I using high status in the spring and only linearly going across the chart? There's no
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
That's right. It's the labels on the first column are what is the most current year. So a school can move from one status level to another, from one year to the next, but it will, whatever it is in the most current year, that then it can only go across.
What it is after 20.
That's right. I'm just making sure I understand.
Question.
Any comments to or any recommendations, Dr. Gone? Brian, question.
Sorry.
Personally, I'll add in that although I may or may not have agreed with all the cut scores that were the indicators last year, I do think it needs to be consistent so that it's comparable data. And I think our communities understand it better if you have numbers that are comparable, as opposed to if there's a lot of change in the novice, apprentice, proficient, distinguished, if there's a lot of change in the actual indicator performance levels, then it's pretty hard to describe. So if there could be minimal change, I think that would make more sense to our communities. Again, I'm not saying I agree with where the indicator performance level descriptions were last year, but I think in order to be consistent, it would be nice to have those along the same numbers. Any thoughts from the panel on that? Any?
I think that's what we heard Superintendent Borcher say as well. I just want to circle back to the point he made earlier. I think I want to make sure that he agrees, my interpretation of that applies here.
Borcher, would you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I agree.
Okay.
I promised I was going to be quiet, so.
Fair enough. I'm not trying to lure you.
Well, I just wanted to be able to give him the opportunity not to agree. So no, thank you, Superintendent Borcher. You always have great input. So does everyone on the committee. So again, thank you so much for that. Any other input from the committee? Okay, Dr. Gong, if you want to proceed, please.
Thank you. If you could go to the next slide, this is another question. These are two questions are actually just mirror images of each other. How should the systems treat change at an indicator level if the school started higher on status or if the school started lower? It really is, do you want to treat schools the same regardless of where they are for change, regardless of where they are in status, or do you want to take where they are in status in consideration? Let me give you an example of that. If we could do the next slide. This is actually, so the example here is, let's say a school was very high in, I'm going to use 2022, and the change is small or negative, and then in 23, but the indicator rating, the indicator rating is still very high. So it was very high, it stayed very high, but the change went down. What are we going to say that is that change? Okay, so let's go to the next slide.
Dr. Gong, just so that I'm clear on that. So if we have a blue school, they remained at blue school, but numerically,
yes,
our indicator dropped.
Yes.
Is that what, okay, that's what
yes.
you're saying.
Their status,
right.
Their status was blue.
Status was
Right.
blue,
Yep,
Right.
they've
Their
got those
status was blue.
components.
but their
Yeah,
actual
we're only,
index, if you will, dropped.
that's correct.
A lot of it.
And here, these are real data. These are from 2018 to 2019. And one reason we were using 2018, 2019 is there were some questions about whether everyone participated in 2021, because we were just coming off the pandemic. There were still some students who didn't come back and test. And so we wanted to use some years where over 95% of the students tested. So this is the top row is shows the top the labels on the top is how much change there is. It's like -10, -10 to -5, -5 to just below 0, then 0 to 4.9, 5 to 9.9, 10. So there's 5-point differences across. And the first row shows schools that were very high, how many of them had that change. And so the first thing you can see when you look at that is 41% of the schools had a change score of 0 to 4.9. 33 had -5 to 0.1. So it's like 74% of the schools are between -5 to +5. Okay, there's smaller numbers going out. And if you look at the percentiles underneath, it says that 82% of that's the 82nd percentile, 82% of the schools had a score of 4.9 or lower. So if you're at 5.0, you're at the like 83rd percentile. If you're 9.9, you're at the 93rd percentile. So and then the bottom two rows are schools that started with a low status. You can see that the schools with a low status, their distribution is pretty different. It's lower. There are more schools that drop there. So if you put a cut score at 5.0, it will include 18% of the schools with a very high status. It includes 6% of the schools with low status. Okay, so the question we're asking is, do you want the standard setters to set a single cut for all schools? Like, a good change would be 5.0. Or do you want them to consider a good change score for a school that starts with very high status is a certain cut, and then a school that had a low change score might have a different cut score for change? Is that question clear? Can you see the situation?
Ask one question just so that I can understand it. Will there be an opportunity for a school that is blue to decline enough and lose their blue status color to green, and a different school that is scoring higher or the same to have a blue color status versus a green color status? And is that the reason why we're having this discussion with this question?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So in other words, you could have a blue school that drops 5 points on the index and be high enough that they would remain blue, versus a blue school that drop 5 points and may have a lower score, may drop to green.
Right.
I think you all are clear on the question, certainly. So the question for you is what you're thinking about that. What's your guidance, your thought about it? And again, we'll be back with you again in May. So, this is not your only opportunity to kind of talk about it, but we're trying to get some structure, some of your early thinking, as we move forward with making the final plans for how to handle the sanitary process. So, Brian, you have a decision comment, you and Laura, before the group is thinking at this point.
If we go back to that color chart, I just wanted to point out something, or yeah, this, or it could be this one.
Color table, is that the?
Yeah, so let's do this one. Let's do this one, then we'll go back to the other one. So you can see that the label is change maintained. And then for the very high, it would be blue. So the standard setters, the first question that they address is what score distinguishes defines maintaining change. And one question we're going to ask, is that the same score we're asking you, is that the same score for a school that's in very high status versus a school that's in high status? And, you know, they have different colors there, but is that the same score? It's going to be like a change maintained. Some people may say, I think that should be like the change should be 0 or above. But let's go back to the slide that's just 3 after this with that one. You could or actually the standard setters, you could direct them, or you could give some advice to them, some guidance, and we will bring this up. Most statistical definitions of change would be plus or minus, would be 0 plus or minus something. It wouldn't be, so if we said, did it decline, we wouldn't say a 0.1 minus 0.1 was a decline, because there's enough wobble in the measurements that we're not sure that that's really a decline. So my advice would be, whoever defines maintained, is that they at least consider doing 0 change plus or minus something. I wouldn't make it as big as -5 to +5. You could see that that would encompass like over half the schools, well over 50% of the schools. But this question, and it's really important when you get that color table. Could a school maintain, in that first one, a blue rating if it declined a little bit? And that's what the standard setters are doing. They're saying, where is that cut going to be? Is it at 0? Is it going to be at -0.1, -0.5? That's the judgment we're asking them to make, and we're asking you to in addition, to give guidance on 2 questions. One is, do you think that the maintained or declined should be more of like a plus or minus statistical definition, or an absolute one, like if you decline 0.01, that's going to be declined. Maybe the other question we're asking that you've heard, I'll just repeat, is that cut score for declined or maintained going to be the same for regardless of the status level of the school? If you have any suggestions now, that would be helpful for us in working up more detailed things and coming back to you. If you have any advice now, that would be great.
I think the difficulty in the question, Dr. Gong, is in years past, we looked at each individual student and how much did they change. And they were assigned a score based on individual student. Then you were given an index overall after the students were combined. Now we're looking at the school as a whole, and we may be comparing, we're not comparing the same set of students with each other. We're just saying this is the index this year, next year.
Yes.
Okay, so that's one thing. It's hard to kind of wrap your mind around, or my mind around, because it's a total different look at how to look at change. You're not looking at the individual student. You're looking at the overall school of an index from one year to the next, or a performance level. So you're basically, in a nutshell, you're asking us, should we lean more heavily on a change in status from blue to green, green to blue, or should we look more at a hard number of, you decrease by X number of points, then you're going to have a certain amount of change. Is that correct? Or a change rate?
Yeah, very, very, very good points.
I'll reframe the question just one way in case it's helpful. I think another way of thinking about it is, are you okay with the idea of the same change score meaning something different, resulting in a different change category dependent on the status? Does that make sense, Brian? Is that helpful?
You know, the reason this came up originally was the easiest example people had was very high performing schools. They said, we're not sure that they can change very much. They may be bumping up against the ceiling. So we don't want to require that they make a certain number of points and change in order to get a high rating. That was the original case that people had. It turns out that it's not only that case. It's every status level. People say, well, do I need to consider something like that or not?
Dr. I think I'm going to recommend that we will meet again in May and before all the process starts. So allow us to kind of digest this, put a little more thought into it before we say we'd like to look at a straight number versus a color, and maybe get some input from our fellow superintendents and as well as from people inside our district. And that way we can have that answer for you before you move into the process in June. That'd be okay, Doctor?
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Superintendent Fletcher, I'll just mention something. We're doing a number of analyses on these. I'll mention two parts just as a type of thing that will help inform. We can bring those to you, or we'll send them ahead of to you in your meeting in May. One is how many schools changed status levels in 2018-19, and the answer was 11% went up one level, 13% went down one level. Everyone else stayed the same. So you remember one of the things we were saying is we want change to be sensitive enough to reflect changes in schools, but not be so sensitive that schools flip around. If we do a change that require a school to change like a color level or a status level, there are very few schools that actually do that. The second thing I'll just mention is that I mentioned that this is 18-19 data. We are looking at 21-22 data just because we feel like it's important, even though we know it's not 100% of the school students in 21. The change information, the change scores from 21-22 are very different than 18-19. And when the standard setters come together, we will have the actual 22-23 data, but we won't have that much beforehand in order to do this, modeling. So we're going to do the best to inform you and the standard setters and KDE about what the data might be. We already know that the 18-19, the information before the pandemic, had the change scores were much less. In 21-22, the change scores are much larger than they were before. Okay, so and I think what people are saying is that's great because it shows that schools went down and they're recovering. They went down in 21, now they're recovering. One question for us is that rate of recovery still going to happen between 22 and 23? And so we'll do our best to have that information for the standard setters. But I don't think that changes the fundamental policy questions that we're asking you to provide guidance on.
This is Kelly Ransell, Anchorage Independent. I did just want to jump in and say that I do think before a school is penalized, there should be that plus minus, not just an absolute if you drop. I don't think that would be fair to a school district or school for there not to be a range that's a plus and minus around where they were the prior year.
Okay. So if we go just to the last slide, we'll just remind LSAC where we are in this. We will come back in your May 30th meeting and check in with you, and we'll look for any policy guidance you have about either the process or the policy guidance to give to the standard setters. And some of the policy guidance that we've heard today was in setting standards, support comparisons across time. So minimize changes that would make it difficult or impossible to make comparisons. I think the other one was recognize. I would phrase it as recognize that there may be some measurement error. So don't do absolute cut scores. Put a range in for considering change. So those are two possible policy guidelines. We'll come back and hear what other guidance you have for us in a couple of months. Thank you.
I guess looking at the difference between status and change in each individual makeup of a school score, what would be the determining, I don't want to say calculation, but that's what we're really asking for, an overall score. How will change be factored into that? Will it be a compilation of change and status together to get an overall score? Or is what we just discussed the overall score?
So Brian, did you hear that?
Yes, yeah. The system is easy to be confusing because it's so complex. The statute has status and change being combined to give an indicator performance rating, and then the indicator performance ratings are combined to give the overall score, and the indicator performance ratings are going to be combined using the weights that were set by the Kentucky Board of Education, and the status and change are going to be combined using that color table. So we will give an example when we come back of each step of how each part is combined and leads to the overall rating and score.
So to be clear with status, once we go back, make that determination if those are going to change. With change, really the big questions that you're asking us to really consider before the next meeting is whether schools that had the same performance level for change should be separate colors based on whether they increase, stay the same, or decline. And then something very similar for the lower end, which I would assume would be our TSI classification school. That really what
the TSI and CSI doesn't line up perfectly to the color, but obviously they're at the lowest end. They're about 5%. But it isn't automatic that you must be red.
I mean, I understand now. But am I correct on that?
Okay. And I don't want to speak for you, and Brian, Laura, but I'm assuming if superintendents that are listening to this today, this group, if you have thoughts or questions before we move to May, that it would be helpful to sort of get those in advance if you have them. Because then
absolutely,
what data to back, display to show you, those kinds of things. So I would assume that would Meredith, Dr. Gruber, they can go through you and then you'll get that to us and we'll get to all the programming. So like if on your long drive home or if you're stuck on the interstate and you have something come to you, we welcome those.
Don't email us then, please, but make a note.
Last question I have, before we load it up for any other questions. The 26-member committee, is that a different group or is that the same group?
The plan is to go forth to the 26 and ask, are they available and interested in participating again? Are they in the same roles? People who are in different kinds of roles. So that would be the first thing. Our goal is to try to get something out late this week or early just to those 26 that were confirmed. Then, we're going to have some people who say, I'm tired, I moved to a different role. Then we're going to need to plug in similar roles and make sure we have a good balance across the state. And then obviously, I think we had 2 members that are here today from this group. And so we now have an advance look at those dates. We had SCAC recently. We shared those dates there. So there were 2 people from SCAC that were involved. So the goal would be to start, because there's a lot of learning, as you all know, participating. The goal is to start by asking the committee that was there last time and then fill in as we need to. for people who decline or it just doesn't fit their schedule to different chapter in life or something.
And one of the reasons I brought that up is this group, the next time we meet in May, you decide if you want to have the same two members or two new members or one member stay, one member go. That's something I'd like this committee to consider the next time that we meet in May, which two. Superintendent Mitchell and I were the two that represented before. Again, I'll be more than happy to let someone else have that perspective on the committee to see the process. Be happy to put any input in it at all possible, but again, I think it is important for different members of LSAC. If they want to, if they are interested, just let me know and we'll bring that up at the next meeting. Superintendent Mitchell, I think, did an excellent job. I think everybody that was on that committee, there was a lot of great discussions, very thoughtful. It's a good process. I think it's good for people to participate. Any other questions from the group?
I'd just like to make a request. We've heard lots of stuff here today. So, because I agree with Dr. Fletcher, I'd like to reach out to other superintendents, especially the ones that I represent at REC and in my district, but also district leaders of the school district I work in. But I just want to make sure that I'm asking the right question, if that makes sense.
I was thinking this as well, Jim, you're probably doing the same thing. We might, could Brian and you and Laura are open to that, maybe we could develop a little, like a one pager kind of draft and with the questions to think about that would maybe help you in conversation with it. Everybody good with that? Brian and Laura, is that something you think?
I was thinking the same thing, Rhonda, we're on the same page. Mm-hmm. And hopefully the slides are helpful now that we've walked through them as well. I know just kind of getting a slide deck and looking at some tables, you're kind of doing your best, but I hope that also can be a tool for you.
Start to put together some sort of thing that will help articulate the question. Also, you notice we have more time built in. Part of that also is more review time for you before you actually would say approve or not approve the cuts. So remember last year, that was a very compressed timeline. We pulled that out. We're not trying to hit a particular report day. We'll do it as quickly as we can turn everything around, but we want to give you adequate time to really look at it, think about it, and have conversations. So that was a good learning we took away from last year.
So, yeah, appreciate that. I appreciate the process. I know that y'all put a lot of time and it's a very complex process, and I appreciate the additions very much.
Any other questions? Again, thank you, Rhonda and Jennifer. You guys did a phenomenal job. You answered the tough questions with a lot of voice. We appreciate that, and a lot of background too. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for the presentation. Okay, anything else for the good of the group? We've passed our last agenda item. To have a motion to adjourn. By Mr. Cochran, second. Second. Mr. Burchett. And we are adjourned. Thank you, folks, for a great meeting.